A black satellite phone sat on the tray table of seat 14A, untouched, silent, and coded to reach only one place, the Pentagon's Strategic Command. Terrence Ward didn't raise his voice as the flight crew surrounded him, didn't flinch when they demanded his bag, or when the white woman beside him called him a threat. He had faced down insurgents, briefed generals, advised on terrorist networks, but none of that mattered here. 30,000 feet above the ground, uniform no longer visible, all they saw was a quiet black man with the wrong kind of calm. Then he made the call. Minutes later, air traffic control interrupted the flight path with a direct order. The man in seat 14A was a high-level federal advisor en route to deliver Pentagon intelligence. What began as profiling had triggered a chain of federal consequences, and the full system hadn't even responded yet. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The seatbelt sign was off, but the tension pressing down across row 14 felt tighter than any strap could hold. Major Terrence Ward sat in the aisle seat, shoulders relaxed, his tall frame angled just enough to give the window passenger room to breathe. He hadn't spoken since takeoff, hadn't so much as looked toward the woman in 14B beyond a polite nod when she sat down, yet her discomfort had been simmering since wheels up. And now it was beginning to boil. She shifted again, arms crossed tight over her chest, her legs angled sharply away from him, as if proximity alone were a threat. The flight was smooth, the engine steady. The murmurs of conversation and the occasional ding of a flight attendant call button echoing softly through the cabin. But here, right beside her, it might as well have been a combat zone the way she kept glancing at him, jaw tight, breath shallow, eyes flicking down toward the small black duffel under his seat, like it was ticking. Terrence felt it, of course, not just the side glances or the tension in her posture, but the deeper shift, that subtle charge in the air, the kind that trained men learned to recognize before danger unfolded. He didn't move, didn't speak, just kept his hands on the armrest, one thumb lightly brushing the edge of his boarding pass, the other resting on his thigh. Calm, measured, unthreatening. He'd learned long ago that nothing escalated a situation faster than defending yourself too early. The flight attendant passed by, smiling absently as she checked belts and trays. Cassandra Myers leaned in and tapped her arm, her voice hushed but urgent. "Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but the man next to me, I don't feel safe." The attendant blinked, caught off guard, then leaned down slightly. "Is something wrong? I don't know. He hasn't said anything, but something's off. I think he might have a weapon. He keeps reaching near his bag." Terrence didn't flinch. He kept his eyes forward, jaw tight now, chest rising slowly beneath his gray sweater. The attendant glanced down, then looked toward him, uncertainty flickering in her expression. Terrence turned to meet her gaze for the first time. "Is there a problem?" The woman hesitated. Her training told her to de-escalate, to ask neutral questions, but the passenger beside him was already breathing faster, already twisting her fingers in her lap, already feeding the unease with every nervous glance. Behind them, a man across the aisle leaned forward slightly, watching. A teenager one row up lowered her phone from a game to peek backward. "I'm going to ask you to keep your hands visible, sir," the attendant said carefully, trying to keep her voice even. "There's just been a concern raised. Would you mind opening your bag for me?" Terrence blinked once, slowly. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The silence stretched just long enough to draw more attention before he finally said, voice quiet and clipped, "What's the concern?" The attendant looked back toward Cassandra, who looked right past her and locked eyes with Terrence, now emboldened. "He keeps touching his bag like there's something in it. I saw him. He checked it 3 times before we took off. He hasn't said a word. That's suspicious, isn't it? He won't even talk to me." Terrence's lips pressed together. His hand hadn't been near the bag once since boarding. He'd adjusted his seatbelt, checked his boarding pass, and then folded his arms. That was it, but it didn't matter. Not when fear had already found a shape to settle into. "Sir," the attendant tried again, her voice firmer now, layered with the stress of rising stakes. "We need to make sure there's no danger on board. Please open your bag." Terrence didn't move. "I'm not opening anything without cause," he said, measured and low. "If you believe there's a threat, you call the captain and follow protocol. But I'm not consenting to a search because someone got nervous next to a black man on a plane." There it was, spoken plainly. No edge in his voice, just the kind of calm that carried weight. The attendant straightened, startled. Cassandra drew in a sharp breath and leaned back as if the words themselves were an admission of guilt. "You see, he's being hostile. He's being direct," the man across the aisle muttered. But the attendant didn't acknowledge it. "I'll be right back," she said, already turning down the aisle. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Terrence leaned back, folding his arms again. He could feel Cassandra's eyes drilling into the side of his face, could feel the heat of half the cabin now trying not to stare too obviously. This wasn't new. Not really. Airports, security checks, delayed boardings. It came in different forms, but it always came. Only now it was happening mid-air, 35,000 feet above the ground, in front of strangers who couldn't look away. He exhaled slowly, controlled. His fingers brushed once more along his thigh, near the jacket folded in his lap, where a small device waited quietly beneath the fabric. Compact, matte black, military-issued, locked to a channel no commercial network could access. He hadn't wanted to use it, had hoped he wouldn't have to. But he hadn't come this far to be humiliated by fear dressed up as protocol. When the curtain parted again, and the male flight attendant returned with 2 others in tow, Terrence knew the next moment would set everything in motion. The mood in the cabin shifted again, not from turbulence or mechanical failure, but from something quieter and more insidious. The kind of fear that spread in glances and whispers, in the cautious way people adjusted their posture, in the tightening of silence where conversation had once filled the air. As the 3 attendants made their way down the aisle, passengers leaned just enough to see without seeming obvious, phones angled subtly, fingers already hovering near record buttons, not out of certainty, but out of curiosity, stoked by suggestion. The lead among them, a man in his early 40s with graying temples and a forced calm behind his professional smile, stopped beside row 14 and crouched slightly, his voice low but unmistakably firm as he addressed Terrence. "Sir, I need to ask you to stand up." Terrence didn't move. His arms remained folded, eyes locked forward. He didn't respond with anger, only a kind of practiced restraint that had been worn into him by years of being in rooms, vehicles, and countries where missteps were fatal. Where the first wrong gesture could write the end of a story no one would ever hear. "For what purpose?" he asked, voice level. "There's been a concern raised about your behavior, and in the interest of everyone's safety, we're asking for full cooperation." Cassandra leaned back, lips pressed into a thin line, watching eagerly now, as though vindication were finally arriving in uniform. The man didn't meet her eyes, but he didn't need to. He was already acting in accordance with the image she had painted. "I've already explained," Terrence replied, gaze steady. "There's been no behavior. I've been seated, quiet, and respectful since boarding. If you're acting on a passenger's discomfort, that's one thing. But if you're escalating that into a forced inspection without cause, we're no longer discussing safety. We're discussing liability." The attendant straightened, tension creeping into his jaw. He glanced at the other 2 beside him, a young woman trying not to look nervous, and a man who had clearly been called in as support but didn't seem eager to be involved. The lead tried again. "This doesn't have to be difficult. We can escort you to the rear of the cabin to talk in private." "I'm comfortable here," Terrence answered, not raising his voice, not budging. "And I'm not leaving my seat for a conversation based on someone's assumptions. If there's a legitimate threat, you contact the captain and secure the aircraft. Otherwise, this is targeted harassment, and you'll answer for it." The words weren't shouted, but they landed with force, drawing in even more eyes. 2 rows ahead, a man lowered his newspaper completely. Across the aisle, a young couple exchanged quiet words. Everyone had felt the shift. That moment where it was no longer about the woman's fear, but about whether the crew would choose to act on it, whether protocol would bend to comfort at the expense of justice. The attendant looked back toward the curtain, clearly debating whether to call the captain now or continue pressing. He chose the latter. "We're trying to avoid involving the cockpit," he said, his voice stiff. "But we do have the authority to search a passenger's belongings in response to a credible concern. And I have the right to deny an unlawful search without cause," Terrence answered, his tone calm, his body still. "You have no warrant, no probable cause, and no specific behavior you can point to. Only the word of someone who doesn't like who she's sitting next to." Cassandra scoffed beside him, leaning in just enough to make sure her voice carried. "Unbelievable. He's refusing a search. That should tell you everything." Terrence turned his head just slightly, meeting her eyes for the first time since the flight began. His expression didn't shift, didn't flare with anger or condescension, only disappointment, the kind that said he'd seen this before, and it never got less exhausting. "You don't know anything about me," he said, voice low. "You made up your mind before we even left the ground. And now you're acting like you've got something to hide." "I have something to protect," he replied. The attendant cut in quickly, his voice rising a notch to cover the tension. "Sir, this is your last warning. If you don't comply, we will have to restrain you until we can land and investigate further." At that, Terrence moved, not suddenly, not aggressively, but with a slow deliberateness that made the younger attendant take a half-step back. He reached into his lap, into the folds of the gray jacket still resting there, and withdrew a small object, placing it gently on his tray table. A sleek, compact satellite phone. Military-grade, black matte casing. Unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The cabin didn't erupt in panic, but the energy shifted again, a ripple of silence moving outward from the center of the plane as passengers caught sight of something they didn't understand, and the crew didn't expect. The lead attendant's mouth opened slightly, unsure whether to call for help or freeze. "I'm placing one call," Terrence said, his eyes steady on the attendant. "I suggest you wait." He dialed with his thumb, then brought the phone to his ear. No speakerphone, no threats, no raised voice. Just a few quiet words exchanged in a tone too flat to be casual. Whatever he said, it didn't last more than 10 seconds. Then he ended the call, set the phone back down, and looked up. "Now," he said, "we wait for the captain." The attendants stood frozen in place, uncertain whether to move, speak, or retreat. Cassandra turned sharply, glancing between them, her mouth tightening as confusion set in. Something had changed. No one knew what exactly, but the weight of it was unmistakable. The silence after the call was thicker than before, drawn across the cabin like a sheet stretched tight, barely holding back the unraveling tension beneath. Terrence hadn't moved since placing the satellite phone on the tray table, and though his posture remained composed, the shift in the room was unmistakable. The presence of the device, and the calm, cryptic confidence with which he'd used it, left the attendants visibly unsettled, their planned course of action now entangled with questions they weren't trained to answer. But uncertainty was a fragile thing in the air, especially when prodded by fear. Cassandra leaned back, but kept glancing at the phone like it might suddenly come to life. Her discomfort had twisted into something sharper now. No longer just fear, but the bruised ego of someone who expected the world to rally behind her claim, and was now watching that control slip away. Her voice was tight when she spoke again, no longer hushed. "He just made a call on a device I've never seen before. I don't know who he's talking to or what he just did. Are we really going to sit here and let this go?" The lead flight attendant turned toward her, visibly unsure, but her words lit a spark. The other passengers, who had been quiet, watching, recording, began to murmur again. this time less certain of who the danger was supposed to be. Still, fear had a way of choosing sides long before facts arrived. The younger male attendant stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, I need you to hand over the phone." "No," Terrence said simply, his tone steady. "It's secure equipment, not for civilian inspection." "I'm not asking," the man snapped, trying to summon authority he didn't fully possess. "You're exceeding your jurisdiction," Terrence replied. "You are not law enforcement, and this is not a threat scenario. You're reacting to a passenger's discomfort. Nothing more." The lead attendant leaned in again, now visibly sweating. "You don't get to dictate our response midair, sir. You brought a military device onto a commercial flight and refused inspection. We have a responsibility to protect every passenger." Terrence held his gaze without blinking. "And I've done nothing to compromise that responsibility. The only threat here is the one you're creating." The lead attendant hesitated, then turned slightly, whispering something into the small comms device clipped to his collar. Moments later, the curtain parted again. 2 additional crew members stepped out, and behind them, the captain himself entered the aisle. Broad-shouldered, late 50s, eyes sharp and skin drawn tight from years in pressurized cabins. His expression was unreadable as he approached row 14, surveying the scene with a pilot's practiced calm. "What exactly is the situation here?" he asked, his voice even but edged. Cassandra was the first to answer. "He made a call on some military phone after refusing to be searched. He's acting like he's above the law. I don't feel safe." The captain looked to the flight crew. The lead attendant nodded stiffly. "He refused inspection, then pulled out a secure phone. He claims he's a government official, but he won't identify himself or allow us to verify anything." Terrence looked up at the captain, his eyes steady. "You don't want to do this." "I want my plane to land without incident," the captain replied. "If that means securing a potentially hostile passenger, I'll take that risk." "You're about to make a bigger mistake than you realize," Terrence said, voice low. The captain didn't flinch. "You're being restrained until we land." Before Terrence could respond, the male attendant reached down toward his seatbelt, attempting to unlock it, while another grasped his wrist, not roughly at first, but with the kind of insistence that signaled finality. Terrence didn't resist, not with force, but his body tensed, and when they pulled him from the seat, the effort it took to move him was far greater than they expected. Still, he allowed it. Not because he feared escalation, but because the call had already been made, and what came next was no longer his to manage. Passengers gasped as the scene unfolded. Several phones were out now, recording openly as Terrence was pulled into the aisle, forced to his knees just long enough for restraints to be fastened around his wrists. The captain stepped back as the attendants began to unzip his bag, rifling through it with clumsy urgency. Inside, nothing alarming. Just a paperback novel with folded pages, a clean set of folded documents secured in a binder, a watch wrapped in a sock, and a government ID badge tucked into a side pocket, one they missed entirely in their haste. "There's nothing here," one of them murmured, but the damage was already done. Terrence was restrained, kneeling like a suspect on the floor of a cabin filled with strangers, the hum of engines loud against the silence that had crept over the onlookers. Cassandra stared down at him, unsure now, her confidence faltering as she took in the reality of what she'd helped create. "I warned you," Terrence said quietly, eyes not on her, but on the captain. "You're going to hear from someone very soon, and when you do, you'll understand exactly who you just restrained in front of a cabin full of witnesses." The captain didn't respond. He simply turned and walked back toward the cockpit, his shoulders stiff, his mind clearly working through possibilities he hadn't considered when he first approached. Terrence was lifted and placed back into his seat, still bound, still silent. The phone remained on the tray table, untouched, and as the plane continued its smooth course toward Washington, the tension aboard no longer rested on the suspicion of a single woman or the misjudgment of a nervous crew. It now hovered in the unknown, in the looming sound of consequences that had already taken flight. Terence sat upright, his shoulders drawn back against the seat, but his wrists still cuffed, the tight plastic biting into his skin with every movement. The silence had turned into something more acidic now, a quiet that wasn't peaceful but heavy. Heavy with stares, with judgment, with the weight of 100 conclusions already drawn and filed away in the minds of those watching. The flight attendants had returned to their stations, but no one had really moved on. Not the crew, not the passengers, and definitely not Cassandra. She hadn't stopped looking at him since they strapped him down, her posture stiff, her mouth set in a tight line like she was daring him to say something. And when he finally did, it cut through the quiet with a sharpness that made even the row behind them stiffen. "You really feel proud of yourself right now?" he asked, turning to her slowly, his voice no longer patient or reserved. "You really think you did something good?" She blinked, caught off guard that he was speaking to her directly, then crossed her arms like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "I did what I had to do. You were acting suspicious. You didn't want anyone looking in your bag. You were being secretive." "You mean I was minding my own business?" he shot back, his voice low but full of heat. "Not once did I talk to you. Not once did I look at you sideways, and somehow that's enough to have me dragged out of my seat like a damn criminal? That sound right to you? You pulled out a military phone," she snapped, shifting in her seat to face him. "What regular person has one of those on a plane?" He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "You don't know anything about me, lady. Not my job, not who I am, not what I've done for this country. But you saw a black man with a serious look and decided that meant danger. That's all this was. I didn't see race. Don't start that with me," she said quickly, her voice rising, her face starting to flush. "Don't twist this into something it's not." "You didn't see race?" he repeated, his laugh sharp now. "You sure about that? 'Cause you didn't call the attendants when that white dude across the aisle kept getting up to check the overhead bin. You didn't flinch when the guy 2 rows up dropped his bag and muttered something about forgotten batteries. But me? I sit quiet. Don't say a word. And you just know something's off, right? You were tense. You kept checking your watch, your phone. My flight was delayed, and I've got a briefing in D.C. I'm trying to keep track of time. That's called being professional, not dangerous. But you got nervous, and instead of checking yourself, you decided the whole damn flight needed to stop and revolve around your fear." She scoffed, eyes narrowing. "You think you're some kind of martyr now? No. I think I'm a man who's sick of this same damn story playing out over and over again," he said, his voice rising. "You don't get to call me a threat and play the victim when it blows back on you. You humiliated me. You got me restrained in front of an entire plane of people. And you still think you're the one who's been wronged?" Cassandra leaned forward, her face now inches from his, fury crackling in her eyes. "You should have just cooperated. That's what normal people do when they've got nothing to hide. And what? Let you sleep better thinking you were right? I don't owe you comfort. I don't owe you an explanation. You saw me, you judged me, and you enjoyed watching them put their hands on me." She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, chest rising and falling faster now. "You're a joke," she muttered, her voice shaking. "No, you're the joke," he said, leaning slightly closer despite the restraints digging into his wrists. "You threw a tantrum in the sky because the world didn't revolve around you for 5 minutes. And now you're just mad the lie you told is starting to fall apart." "I didn't lie. You're pathetic," he said back. That did it. Her hand flew up before anyone could stop her, and the sharp crack of skin against skin echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Gasps rippled up and down the aisle as Cassandra's palm connected with Terrence's face, snapping his head to the side. His cheek reddened instantly, but he didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't even blink. He turned his head back toward her slowly, his eyes cold, steady, unreadable. She was standing now, hands trembling, chest heaving, as if only in that moment realizing what she'd done and who had seen it. Terrence didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The weight of what had just happened settled over the entire cabin like thunderclouds waiting to burst, and far up in the cockpit, a new voice crackled across the captain's radio. Sharp, urgent, and not from the tower. The call had gone through. The moment hung in the air longer than it should have. Too long for something so violent, so public, so obvious. Cassandra's hand was still raised slightly, as if even she hadn't fully processed the fact that she'd slapped a restrained man across the face in full view of a cabin packed with passengers. Her eyes darted around quickly now, looking not for sympathy, but for support. Some kind of affirmation that what she'd done made sense, that the fear she'd been clutching like armor would still shield her from the weight of what had just happened. But no one said anything. No one nodded. No one even looked at her the same way anymore. Terence didn't speak. He sat there, still bound, the red mark on his cheek already starting to fade. But the heat of humiliation hadn't gone anywhere. His jaw was set now, and the look in his eyes had changed. No longer restrained out of politeness or protocol, but because he knew he wouldn't have to lift a finger for what was coming next. The captain's voice came over the intercom, tight and urgent, and though the words were coded in calm, the tremor beneath them was unmistakable. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We've received a priority message from air traffic control and will be adjusting our course slightly. Flight crew, report to the cockpit immediately. The attendants didn't hesitate. All four of them moved quickly, whispering to one another as they disappeared behind the first-class curtain. The captain was waiting with the radio still in hand, staring down at the coded message displayed on his console, his face pale beneath the glow of the cockpit lights. It wasn't a threat report. It wasn't a security advisory. It was a direct communication from the Department of Defense, marked Level 2 Override. Do not detain the passenger in 14A. Pentagon clearance confirmed. Comply with all requests immediately. Captain to issue public apology. No delay. The captain read it twice before speaking, his voice low, almost apologetic. Is this real? His first officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. There were only a handful of people in the country who had access to that override code. Whoever the man in 14A really was, he had just turned the entire flight crew into unwilling participants in a federal embarrassment. Back in the cabin, Cassandra sat down slowly, her hands still shaking. The slap had not given her the resolution she expected. It hadn't stopped anything, hadn't put the fear back in the bottle. If anything, the silence had grown heavier since then, and now it felt less like judgment and more like anticipation, like everyone around her was waiting for something to drop. It did. The curtain parted again, and the captain emerged, his expression forced into something composed but hollow. He didn't pause. He walked straight down the aisle to row 14, where Terence sat calmly, arms still bound, eyes locked forward. The captain stopped, took a breath, then leaned slightly so the entire cabin could hear him. "Mr. Ward," he said, the name taken from the badge one of the attendants had pulled from his bag moments earlier. "We've just received communication from national defense authorities. You should not have been restrained. I apologize for the misunderstanding and the treatment you've received on this flight." There it was, out loud. No vague phrasing, no corporate buffering. Just the truth, spoken too late to stop what had already happened. "I've instructed my crew to remove your restraints immediately," the captain continued, his voice stiff, eyes flicking quickly toward the few passengers still filming. "If there is anything you require, we are fully at your disposal." Terence turned his head, slowly this time, his face unreadable. "I want my bag back," he said, voice flat. The attendants brought it forward at once, setting it beside him with quiet, nervous hands. The cuffs were cut loose moments later, and Terence stretched his wrists slowly, not because they ached, but because it felt necessary. Because that slow, deliberate motion spoke louder than anything else could in that moment. "Anything else?" the captain asked. "Not yet," Terrence replied without looking at him. The captain nodded once, then turned back down the aisle, aware that every step felt longer now, heavier, like the walk of a man whose authority had just been measured and found wanting. Cassandra didn't say a word. She kept her head down, cheeks flushed, jaw tight. She could feel the stares now. Real ones, this time. Not suspicion, not validation, but the cold weight of knowing she had crossed a line in public and had nowhere to hide from what came next. Terrence shifted slightly in his seat, adjusted the backrest, and folded his arms again, not because he needed the comfort, but because it was a return to the same posture he had held at the start, as if the entire chaos of the last hour had been nothing but a detour back to this moment of calm. Only now, the silence was no longer about suspicion. Now it was about reckoning. The descent into D.C. was quieter than any flight Terrence Ward had ever taken, and not because the passengers were sleeping or the crew had dimmed the lights. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that followed embarrassment, uncertainty, and the dawning realization that something far more serious had taken place than any of them had understood at 35,000 feet. The captain gave no more announcements beyond the standard landing protocol. No apologies were repeated, no explanations offered to the rest of the cabin. Whatever was coming, it had moved well beyond the pay grade of anyone pushing a drink cart or adjusting air vents. The flight attendants stayed mostly out of sight, speaking in hushed tones behind the curtain and avoiding the aisle unless absolutely necessary. Even Cassandra, who had spent most of the flight wide-eyed and muttering indignantly, now sat perfectly still, her hands clutched in her lap, her eyes trained on the seat back in front of her, like she could will herself into disappearing before they touched down. Terrence remained calm. He didn't gloat, didn't scan the cabin for reactions, didn't reach for his phone or pull out a book. He just sat there, arms folded once again, his gaze drifting occasionally to the window as the lights of the Capitol began to rise beneath them. He didn't need to say a word. Everything he'd needed to say had already been spoken, and more importantly, already been heard by people far above anyone on this plane. As the wheels touched down, there was no clapping, no murmurs of relief, just the solid, grounded hum of tires meeting runway and the subtle shift of bodies preparing for what came next. The plane taxied slowly, almost deliberately, and it was only when it veered away from the terminal toward a restricted tarmac lane that some of the passengers began to understand what was happening. Two black SUVs waited just off the access road, parked at the edge of a small hangar where private jets typically came and went. Beside them stood a trio of men in dark suits, earpieces visible, hands clasped in front of them, faces unreadable even from a distance. As the aircraft slowed to a stop, no gate came into view, no jet bridge extended. Just the stairs, lowered from the belly of the plane, and a silence so complete it felt like a warning. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain finally said, his voice flat but audible through the intercom, "please remain seated. We are being met by federal personnel for a matter unrelated to your travel. Do not attempt to disembark until instructed." The words hit the cabin like a splash of cold water. Terrence didn't move, but he saw the change immediately. The turning heads, the widened eyes, the breath held in anticipation. The same people who had quietly judged him earlier were now watching with a different kind of curiosity, one tangled with guilt and uncertainty. They didn't know exactly who he was, but they knew enough now to realize they'd watched the wrong man get humiliated. The door opened, and the first figure to board wasn't wearing a uniform, but his posture alone made it clear he didn't need one. His suit was pressed, his expression calm, but his eyes scanned the cabin with intent, and when he spotted Terrence, he didn't waste time. He gave a subtle nod, and two more agents stepped inside behind him. "Major Ward," the man said, his voice polite but firm, "we apologize for the delay in response. If you're ready, we're prepared to escort you off the aircraft." Terrence stood without hesitation, retrieving his bag from under the seat with a quiet dignity that only underscored the contrast between this moment and the one that had come before. The crew stepped aside immediately. The passengers stared openly now. Cassandra watched him stand with wide, hollow eyes, her lips parted slightly, as if unsure whether to speak or shrink back into her seat. He paused once, only briefly, to look down at her, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with something colder, disappointment. "You should be ashamed," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "And don't think for 1 second you won't be held accountable." She didn't reply. Her face had drained of all color, and her fingers gripped the edge of the armrest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. As Terrence stepped off the plane, the agents fell into formation around him. Not like he was in danger, but like he was someone who had been wronged and was now being restored to where he belonged. The SUV door opened. One agent held it for him. The others stayed posted. Back inside the plane, a second group boarded. They weren't here for Terrence. They asked to speak with the flight crew. One of the attendants was visibly shaking as he followed them toward the rear, and even the captain looked hollow as he was escorted off. The lead agent informed the crew that an internal investigation had already begun, and that they were to be placed on temporary leave, effective immediately. Cassandra Myers was last. Her name was called over the intercom by a voice she didn't recognize, a tone that held no question, only command. She stood slowly, as if still waiting for someone to tell her it was a mistake, that this had gone too far. But when she reached the front of the plane, 2 agents stepped forward. "Cassandra Myers," one said, holding up a tablet with her photo already displayed. "You are being detained under Federal Statute 18 U.S. Code, Parv 111, for assaulting a federal officer in the line of duty." She gasped, barely able to speak. "What? I didn't know who he was. He didn't say." "Doesn't matter," the agent replied. "You struck a federal operative. That's all we need." Her voice broke as they led her down the stairs. Passengers stared in stunned silence as she disappeared, her cries muffled by the wind. No one cheered. No one said a word. But the silence that followed was no longer confused. It was earned. The footage hit the internet before Terrence's SUV even cleared the private tarmac. Grainy phone videos taken from 3 different angles showed the slap, the restraint, the quiet rage in his voice, and the cold shift that followed once the captain received the call. It spread faster than the airline's press team could respond. Pushed by headlines that didn't bother softening the truth. Veteran humiliated midair after false accusation. Pentagon confirms passenger was federal operative. White passenger detained after assaulting black veteran on flight. By morning, the clips were leading every news cycle. Cable anchors recited timelines in sober tones, while legal analysts debated on live panels whether the woman should be charged with a hate crime. Social media didn't need convincing. Millions of views poured in. Tags trended by sunrise. Her major ward, flying while black. No fly for Cassandra. Celebrities, veterans, even politicians posted their outrage. By noon, the airline's stock had dipped 4%, and their official account had turned off replies on every post they'd made in the last week. The airline's first statement was a short, polished apology that offered sympathy without blame. It backfired immediately. Critics called it hollow. Passengers on the flight began giving interviews to local news outlets. One woman teared up on camera as she described how calm Terrence had been. He never raised his voice, not once. They just wouldn't leave him alone, and when he finally spoke up, they treated him like he was the problem. Another passenger, a man in his 60s, said flatly, "That woman never should have been listened to." She weaponized her fear, and they handed her the tools. By the time the Pentagon released a confirmation of Terrence's identity and clearance level, the story had already outgrown its origin. This wasn't just about one man being profiled. It had become a symbol, another brick in the wall of what too many people already knew. that respectability didn't matter, that service didn't protect you, that a calm voice and clean record didn't guarantee dignity once suspicion took hold. When Terrence finally appeared on camera, it wasn't from a podium or a studio, but from the steps of a quiet building near the National Mall. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the same look he'd worn hundreds of times while briefing senior defense officials. There were no flashbulbs, no media circus, just a single interview, filmed in one long take, no cuts, no edits. The reporter asked him gently, "Do you think this would have happened if you weren't black?" Terrence didn't hesitate. No. He let the word sit for a second, then went on, "I've worn the uniform. I've served overseas. I've risked everything for this country. And none of that mattered the moment I sat down next to a woman who didn't like the way I looked. That should tell you something about where we are." He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to moralize. He spoke plainly, with the same precision he used in the field. Calm, focused, unflinching. "I didn't call for anyone to lose their job. I didn't ask for that woman to be arrested. But actions have consequences. And if I had done what she did, if I'd slapped her across the face on that flight, I wouldn't have made it to the ground in one piece. We both know that. Everyone watching knows that." The clip was shared more than the original footage. Within hours, it had been translated into 6 languages and subtitled by volunteers across the globe. Editorials followed. Op-eds ran in every major paper. The Washington Post wrote, "Major Ward didn't ask for justice. He became it." Meanwhile, the airline scrambled. The CEO issued a new statement, this time filmed. He acknowledged failure. He promised sweeping reforms. He announced that every member of the flight crew had been suspended pending investigation, and that the company would begin implementing mandatory bias training across all departments. But no one clapped. The public had seen enough performative apologies to know the difference. What they wanted was accountability, not branding. Cassandra Meyer's name was already being scrubbed from flight databases nationwide. After being booked and released on bail, her attorney issued a prepared statement blaming the situation on heightened post-pandemic anxieties and misunderstood interactions. The public wasn't buying it. She lost her job at a consulting firm by week's end. Her neighborhood Facebook group removed her. Someone leaked a recording of her screaming at police during the arrest, demanding to be let go because he didn't say who he was. The clip only made things worse. In the background, the Department of Transportation opened an inquiry into racial profiling procedures across commercial airlines. Congressional leaders from both parties issued calls for federal oversight of in-flight discrimination protocols. A proposal for an independent aviation review board gained traction, its sponsors citing the need to prevent another Major Ward incident before it happens again. Terrence stayed mostly quiet through it all. He declined most interview requests. He didn't tweet. He didn't post. He didn't have to. His story had already done the talking. The noise never fully died down. Even weeks after the incident, the name Terrence Ward still carried a pulse in headlines, still appeared on panel shows, still echoed through think pieces and op-eds trying to define what the moment meant. But Terrence had moved on, not because he didn't care, not because it hadn't mattered. He just understood how much louder action could speak when it wasn't asking for applause. His work with the Pentagon resumed without fanfare. Meetings continued, briefings remained classified, and his voice returned to the rooms where it had always mattered most. But it was what he did outside of that circle that began to ripple wider than anyone expected. It started with a message from an old contact, one of those quiet professionals who didn't work from an office, but from whatever country needed stability that week. A young black man in Baltimore had been detained at the airport while flying to a cybersecurity summit overseas. Despite having proper credentials, a return ticket, and glowing recommendations, he had been flagged at customs, questioned for 5 hours, and nearly sent home under suspicion of unverifiable intent. No charges, no apology. Terrence didn't make a public statement. He didn't send out a tweet. He simply placed a call, one that bypassed middlemen and went straight to the desk of a deputy director responsible for overseeing federal aviation policy. There were no threats, no raised voices, just facts, laid out clean, professional, and precise. Within 24 hours, the man had an official apology, an escorted rebooking, and a direct line of communication for future travel security clearance. No press release followed. The man didn't even know who had pulled the strings. But Terrence wasn't looking for recognition. He was doing what needed to be done, the same way he always had, quietly, thoroughly, and without ceremony. He started doing it more often. A single mother in Atlanta flagged as suspicious for booking last-minute flights on standby. Terrence ensured she was placed on the TSA's expedited verification list. A Nigerian PhD candidate nearly deported after a database glitch misread his academic visa. Terrence had it fixed before the university even responded to the inquiry. He wasn't trying to change the world, but he knew exactly how to move through the places where others got stuck, how to open the doors that too many people never even got to knock on, and he did it without needing to tell the world he was doing it. He still declined every speaking invitation. He turned down 3 documentaries and politely refused a nomination for a civil rights award. His answer was always the same. That wasn't the point. He didn't want the moment to be about him. He wanted it to matter because it forced change, not because it built a brand. And in that quiet, behind-the-scenes way, he'd already started building something bigger than any one person could name. The airline industry began shifting, not all at once, not in perfect ways, but noticeably. New federal guidelines were pushed forward, rooted in what had happened to him. Airport training modules were rewritten. Bias screenings became part of employee evaluations. Security staff were retrained under new oversight. And for the first time in a long while, the story of a man being profiled and dehumanized didn't end with apologies and empty platitudes. It ended with actual structural change. None of that changed what had happened on the plane. It didn't erase the slap. It didn't undo the looks or the silence or the humiliating walk down the aisle in cuffs, but it made sure that next time there might be a pause, long enough for someone to ask the right question instead of assuming the wrong answer. Terrence sat at the edge of a community event one Sunday morning, not as a speaker, but as a guest. A youth mentorship program had invited local veterans to spend the morning with high school students interested in leadership careers. He sat in a folding chair beside a row of students, listening more than talking, answering questions only when asked, and deflecting every compliment with a nod. A girl no older than 17 looked up from her notepad and said, "Mr. Ward, are you always that calm when people test you?" He smiled faintly, the kind that came from experience rather than confidence. "Not always," he said, "but I know what it costs when I'm not." She nodded slowly, writing something down, and he watched her pen hover over the page for a long moment before she looked up again. "You think it was worth it? All the stuff that happened?" Terrence looked across the gym, where volunteers passed out food and veterans laughed with kids who weren't even born when they served. "Ask me in a year," he said, "but it's a good start." He didn't need cameras to say that. No one was filming. No one was posting. It was just a room full of people trying to do better, and for now, that was enough. The invitation came through back channels. Not official, not public, not forced. Just a quiet message relayed through a mediator. Someone who had worked with both legal teams. Someone who believed, maybe naively, that a conversation between them could still matter. Terrence had no obligation to say yes. Cassandra Myers wasn't part of his life, didn't affect his work, didn't have any bearing on the reforms that had followed. But something about the request lingered in his mind longer than he expected it to. He didn't need an apology. He wasn't sure he even wanted one. But he understood the power of a reckoning, not for himself, but for the person still struggling to understand what they'd done. So he agreed. They met in a quiet office building outside the city, a neutral location chosen for privacy, far from cameras or curious onlookers. The room was plain, just 2 chairs, a table, and a pot of coffee that neither of them touched. Terence arrived first, seated with his hands folded, not guarded but steady. Cassandra entered a few minutes later, her posture unsure, her expression tight, like she'd rehearsed 5 different openings and decided against all of them. She sat down across from him, fidgeted once with the sleeve of her sweater, then looked up. "Thank you for coming," she said. He gave a small nod, but didn't speak. "I know you probably didn't need to," she continued, her voice quieter now. "And I'm not expecting anything. I wanted to say some things without lawyers, without statements, without a microphone in the room." Terence studied her for a long moment, not judging, but waiting, making space for the words to come on her own terms. She took a breath. "I don't know how to explain what I was thinking on that flight. I've tried to play it back 100 times. I've read the articles, I've seen the footage, and every time I watch it, I see myself through your eyes, and I feel sick. I wasn't scared because you did anything wrong. I was scared because you didn't do anything. You were calm, too quiet, and that says more about me than it ever did about you." She paused, twisting her hands in her lap. "I've spent the last 2 months in a hole of my own making. Fired, charged, ridiculed. But the worst part hasn't been the consequences. It's been realizing that I didn't just hurt you. I helped reinforce something that's hurt people like you for generations, and I didn't even realize I was doing it." Terence let the silence stretch a little longer, then finally leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice steady. "You ever think about what it's like to always have to explain yourself before you're misunderstood?" he asked. Not accusing, just asking. To walk into a room knowing you've already been sized up before you say a word? That's what it was like on that flight. I knew the second you stiffened in your seat. I could feel it, the shift. I knew exactly what was coming. Because it's happened before. Maybe not always that loud, not always that public, but it's always there. She nodded slowly, eyes down, listening. "I wasn't surprised when you went to the crew," he continued. "I wasn't surprised when they believed you. What surprised me was how far they went before they stopped asking questions. How fast they acted, like I'd done something without a shred of proof. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," he said. He didn't say it gently, but he didn't say it cruelly either. Just a plain acknowledgement, like a door quietly closing. "I slapped you," she said, her voice cracking. "God, I still don't know what came over me. I think I wanted to win. I felt powerless when the captain apologized to you. I felt humiliated. And instead of sitting with that, I turned it back on you. And I will regret that moment for the rest of my life." He nodded again, still calm, still unreadable. "I've read about you since," she said. "The reforms, the changes. What you've done for people behind the scenes. You didn't use this to get famous. You didn't turn it into a platform. You just helped people. That's what we're supposed to do," he said simply. "Especially when we've been through it." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not with fear, not with defensiveness, but with something closer to understanding. "Is there anything I can do?" she asked. Terence didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Start by recognizing that being sorry isn't the end. It's just the start. You want to do something? Talk to people like you. The ones who think they'd never do what you did. The ones who'd swear they're not part of the problem. Right up until they become it. That's where the work starts." She nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you for this," she said. "You didn't have to show up, but you did." He stood then, smoothing the sleeves of his jacket, no anger in his movements, no sense of victory, just closure. "I didn't do it for you," he said. "I did it for the next time," and with that, he walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind him. The sun had just begun to sink behind the city skyline when Terence stepped through the sliding doors of Reagan National Airport. He didn't carry much, just a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder and a folded jacket draped across one arm. The terminal hummed with the usual rhythm of travelers and announcements, the dull chorus of motion and waiting. No one turned to look at him. No one flinched or whispered or stared too long. And for once, he was thankful for the quiet. He moved through security without incident. The agent glanced at his ID, paused for a moment longer than usual, then looked up with a nod of recognition. Not dramatic, not performative, just a silent acknowledgement that said, "I know who you are, and you won't be treated that way here." Terrence returned the nod and kept walking. Up ahead, a TSA supervisor stood near the entrance to the checkpoint. She was watching the line closely, scanning for problems, adjusting her headset every few minutes. When she saw Terrence approach, her eyes softened just slightly. "Mr. Ward," she said, stepping forward. "Welcome back. You know me?" he asked, not unkindly. She offered a small smile. "I know what you did, and I know our staff just completed a new round of training based on the protocols that came out of your case." He didn't say anything at first, just met her eyes and held them for a moment. "Good," he finally said. "That's what matters." She extended a hand. He shook it once, then moved on, never breaking stride. The flight was short, just a connector to Charlotte, where he'd meet with a group of veterans launching a new mentorship initiative for at-risk youth. He had no speaking role, no leadership title, just a quiet seat at the table, the kind he'd always preferred. But this flight, this moment, the act of boarding without fear, of being seen without being judged, felt like something new, or maybe something overdue. The crew greeted him like any other passenger. No stiffness, no extra glances. The flight attendant, a young man with a calm voice and steady hands, gestured him to his row with practiced ease. Terrence took his seat, stowed his bag, and settled in by the window. He looked out across the runway, watching as the lights blinked in the fading daylight, and let his thoughts drift. Not toward the incident, not toward Cassandra, or the interviews or the reforms, but toward the people he'd met since, the quiet stories shared in passing, the messages from strangers who'd seen themselves in his silence that day and found courage in it. It wasn't about justice anymore. That had come and gone, public and messy and flawed in all the ways justice often is. This was something different now, something longer lasting. A shift, not in policy or headlines, but in how people thought about the world around them, in how they might hesitate next time, before assuming the worst about someone who looked like him, in how they might stop and ask a question, instead of dialing fear straight into authority. He didn't need applause for that, didn't need to trend. All he needed was the knowledge that maybe, because of what happened, someone else might walk through an airport, sit down on a plane, or speak up in a meeting without wondering if their skin would be seen as a signal. As the plane began to taxi, Terrence reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph. Worn at the corners, the color slightly faded. It was an old shot of his unit, taken overseas years ago. Faces young and tired, arms slung over each other's shoulders, dust caked into every crease of their uniforms. Some of those men were gone now. Others had scattered across the country, building quiet lives away from the noise of what they'd survived. But every time he looked at that photo, he remembered why he still fought. Not with weapons or speeches, but with presence, with patience, with the unshakable belief that dignity wasn't something to be requested. It was something to be expected. The wheels left the ground, and as the plane climbed, Terrence leaned back, the photograph still in his hand, the city slowly shrinking below. Somewhere down there, policy meetings would continue. Laws would be drafted. Training would be improved. People would argue over what had happened, and others would try to forget. But none of that changed the fact that the world had watched, and something had shifted. And up here, in the quiet cabin with no tension, no eyes filled with suspicion, no whispered accusations or apologies on standby, a man who had been humiliated and handcuffed for doing nothing but existing was now flying free, on his own terms, with his own story intact. He slipped the photograph back into his pocket, folded his arms, and let the silence settle around him. Not heavy this time, but earned. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.